For as long as human beings have shaped metal, carved stone, painted symbols, or sealed objects inside wooden containers, there has been a quiet belief that certain creations were never meant to exist in the ordinary world. Some objects were designed not for beauty or usefulness, but to hold something that frightened even their makers. These were vessels created to contain intentions, emotions, and events so dark that entire communities whispered about them for generations. In ancient writings scattered across different civilizations, there are references to objects crafted specifically to imprison what people feared they could not destroy. They believed that curses, misfortune, and the shadows of violent acts could cling to physical forms, and that only by binding them inside a carefully constructed object could the living protect themselves from forces they did not understand. The creation of a cursed vessel was never accidental. In many traditions, the object was shaped during moments of intense emotional energy, usually following events marked by betrayal, grief, or conflict. The person crafting the object may not have intended to create something dangerous, but the emotional charge sank into the material like ink into cloth. Over time, these items developed reputations not because of dramatic legends but because of small, consistent patterns of misfortune. Families avoided touching them, travelers refused to carry them, and ancient priests often attempted to bury or seal them away. The idea was not that the object acted on its own, but that it stored a fragment of something unresolved, a piece of human experience so heavy that it distorted the energy around it. One of the oldest examples comes from stone carvings found in abandoned settlements. These stones, simple in appearance, were believed to carry the emotional residue of the rituals performed around them. When people approached these stones, they described sensations of unease, coldness, or sudden fatigue. Legends claim that the stones were created to trap the negative energy released during conflicts between rival clans. The carvings etched into their surfaces were not decorative but symbolic, representing the intent to confine the anger and violence that once threatened the survival of the community. Though centuries have passed, some of these stones remain untouched in remote landscapes, avoided not out of superstition alone, but because history has taught that certain symbols carry weight far beyond their physical presence. Another type of cursed object often mentioned in ancient accounts is the sealed container. These objects were typically made from clay or wood and tightly closed with wax, resin, or rope. The purpose was to trap heavy emotions associated with grief, illness, or unresolved conflict. These containers were hidden beneath floors, buried near crossroads, or stored inside temple walls with the hope that the contents would remain undisturbed. The objects inside were usually ordinary items such as small bones, fragments of cloth, or pieces of metal. What made them dangerous was not the material itself but the intention behind the sealing. Communities believed that opening these containers would release stagnant energy capable of spreading misfortune to anyone nearby. Cursed weapons also appear throughout historical records, often tied to battles or personal betrayals. These weapons carried the spiritual weight of the acts committed with them. Warriors believed that the emotions felt in the final moments of conflict imprinted themselves onto the blade or handle. When these weapons were passed down or taken as trophies, those who carried them reported nightmares, sudden despair, or the feeling of being watched. The belief was not that the weapons sought harm, but that they continued to echo the emotional intensity of their past, affecting anyone sensitive to the energy around them. Across different cultures, these cursed objects served as quiet reminders that human emotion leaves a mark not only on memory but on matter itself. People learned to treat these items with caution because they understood that the past is never completely silent. Objects connected to intense events seemed to retain a kind of atmosphere, a lingering presence that shaped the experience of anyone who came too close. Even today, museums, collectors, and archaeologists report feeling a strange heaviness around certain artifacts whose histories are marked by conflict or tragedy. These experiences echo the ancient belief that some creations were never meant to simply rest in the world, because they carry stories too dark to fade with time. Among the most feared cursed objects preserved in ancient accounts were those created not from emotion alone, but through deliberate intention. In certain priestly traditions, objects were crafted specifically to contain energies believed to be too dangerous to roam freely. These were not ornaments or tools but spiritual prisons, shaped with precision and ritual. The makers understood that dark experiences, unresolved trauma, or hostile intentions could linger in the environment long after an event had ended, influencing the minds and actions of those who lived nearby. To prevent this, they fashioned objects capable of absorbing and holding those forces, isolating them from the community. But over time, these vessels gained a reputation for radiating a heavy, unsettling presence, as if the very act of containing darkness had transformed them into something the living were never meant to touch. One of the most discussed of these intentional vessels was the carved wooden figure used by certain ancient tribes. These figures, often shaped from darkened wood, were believed to imprison the spiritual residue of violent disputes or forbidden rituals. The carving process itself was ritualistic. The wood was collected from trees struck by lightning, chosen for their symbolic connection to power and unpredictability. As the figure took shape, the carver focused on releasing their own fear and anger into the wood, creating an object intended to hold and neutralize negative forces. But instead of rendering these energies harmless, the figures eventually became associated with strange sounds, unsettling dreams, or sudden tensions among those who lived near them. Elders eventually ordered these carved objects to be buried far from settlements, believing that prolonged contact with them distorted human emotions in ways that could not be explained. Another category of cursed object included metal amulets forged in times of social unrest. Blacksmiths were often seen as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual worlds due to their ability to manipulate fire and shape unyielding materials. During moments of collective fear, epidemics, droughts, or political upheaval, blacksmiths were asked to forge amulets intended to contain the emotional chaos affecting the community. The metal absorbed the intensity of these moments, becoming a symbolic anchor for the unresolved tension. But as generations passed, these amulets developed a reputation for causing sudden illness or emotional instability. People described a sensation of heaviness when holding them, as if the object drew out the very energy it had once absorbed. Many of these amulets were eventually hidden inside stone walls or buried in fields to prevent contact. Perhaps the most unsettling cursed objects were those created unintentionally through moments of overwhelming despair. In certain ancient cities, clay vessels used for mourning rituals absorbed the grief of entire families. These vessels, shaped with bare hands and carried during funerary processions, became saturated with the sorrow expressed around them. When the rituals concluded, the vessels were meant to be destroyed so the grief could symbolically return to the earth. But in rare cases, they were forgotten, misplaced, or kept as heirlooms. Over time, the families who possessed them reported misfortune, emotional heaviness, and a persistent sense of loss that did not match their circumstances. Priests eventually recognized that these vessels had become carriers of unresolved sorrow, and they performed rituals to bury them deep beneath sacred grounds, hoping to neutralize the emotional residue trapped inside the clay. Another type of cursed object appears in ancient temple records describing symbols carved into stone tablets meant to trap chaotic forces created during moments of ritual error. Priests believed that incorrect performance of a sacred ceremony could generate an imbalance that needed to be contained before it spread. Stone tablets were carved with specific patterns intended to bind that imbalance. These tablets were powerful not because of their design, but because they captured the emotional weight of the mistake. Priests warned that anyone who handled these tablets without understanding their purpose risked absorbing the confusion and distress they held. As a result, the tablets were often sealed inside underground chambers or abandoned temples, where they remained untouched for centuries. Even simple household objects could become cursed if they were present during moments of extreme conflict. Records from ancient households mention pottery bowls, woven baskets, or wooden tools that were quietly avoided because they had witnessed betrayal, violence, or intense arguments. People believed that the emotional charge of such events lingered on the objects, making them feel cold or unsettling to the touch. Families often chose to dispose of these items discreetly, burying them at the edges of their property or releasing them into rivers. The belief was not that the objects acted with intention, but that the memories they carried influenced the atmosphere of any room they remained in. Through all these examples, one pattern remains clear. Cursed objects were feared not because they possessed supernatural powers, but because they were thought to hold emotional imprints so strong that they altered the experience of those who approached them. Ancient people understood that intense human experiences leave traces, whether on individuals, places, or objects. These cursed objects served as reminders of events that communities wished to forget, yet could not erase. Their stories continue to echo because they touch on something deeply human, the fear that certain emotions, once formed, never truly disappear, but find places to settle in the physical world, waiting to be discovered by those who do not know the weight they carry. As the centuries passed, stories of these cursed objects began to evolve, shaped by the experiences of those who encountered them and by the cultures that tried to interpret their presence. In many ancient societies, people believed that certain objects became cursed simply because they absorbed too much human suffering. These items were not created during rituals or forged with intention. They became vessels of dark energy through prolonged exposure to tragedy. This belief gave rise to one of the most powerful and unsettling categories of cursed objects, those born directly from catastrophic events. When an entire community endured famine, war, or loss, any object present during those moments could become a silent witness to the suffering. Over time, these objects developed a reputation for carrying the emotional residue of those events, creating an atmosphere of unease that spread to anyone who handled them. One vivid example appears in ancient ruins where archaeologists found a collection of children's toys buried beneath collapsed homes. The toys were carved with extraordinary detail, but each one seemed to carry an inexplicable heaviness, as if the sorrow of the families who once lived there had soaked into the wood and clay. Villagers living nearby refused to touch them, insisting that the toys held the pain of the children who never returned. Even specialists reported feeling an emotional weight in their presence, a quiet sadness that lingered long after leaving the site. Such reactions echoed the ancient belief that grief leaves traces more persistent than time itself, and that certain objects, especially those connected to innocence lost, never fully release the energy they absorb. Another deeply feared category of cursed object came from places where betrayal had occurred. In some traditions, when trust was broken within a community, through treachery, jealousy, or violence, objects present during those moments were believed to bind the emotional chaos that followed. These objects often appeared ordinary, a ceramic cup, a small piece of jewelry, or a writing tool. Yet anyone who inherited or discovered them described sudden feelings of tension, suspicion, or unrest. The belief was that betrayal created an emotional fracture so powerful that it left an imprint on anything nearby. These objects served as reminders of the consequences of broken trust, and communities often disposed of them in fires or buried them in unmarked ground to prevent the emotional residue from infecting others. Perhaps the most unsettling cursed objects documented across several ancient cultures were mirrors. These mirrors were not the polished glass we know today, but reflective surfaces crafted from metal, obsidian, or water-filled bowls. People believed that mirrors absorbed not only the images reflected in them, but also the emotional states of those who gazed into them. During times of mourning, illness, or spiritual conflict, mirrors were covered or removed from homes because they were thought to capture the sorrow or instability of the moment. Some mirrors discovered in ancient tombs were found deliberately shattered or placed face down, as though their owners feared they might continue to reflect the darkness of the past. Legends describe individuals who inherited old mirrors and experienced sudden changes in mood or sleep disturbances, reinforcing the idea that some reflective surfaces were never meant to reveal more than a single lifetime. Another powerful category involved objects used repeatedly for harmful purposes. In ancient justice systems, tools associated with punishment or conflict were believed to accumulate the emotional turmoil of those who suffered around them. Over time, these objects became symbols of fear and anguish, and even after they were no longer used, their presence created discomfort. Communities often insisted that such objects be sealed away in stone chambers or buried beneath sacred grounds to prevent their lingering energy from disturbing the living. These practices highlight the ancient understanding that suffering leaves echoes, and that objects connected to repeated acts of pain become carriers of emotional patterns too heavy for ordinary life. There were also cursed objects created from misunderstandings or fears surrounding unfamiliar cultures. Travelers who returned from distant lands sometimes brought home items whose meaning they did not fully understand. When misfortune followed, communities blamed the objects, believing they carried foreign energies incompatible with local traditions. These misunderstandings birthed legends of cursed idols or forbidden artifacts, many of which were simply cultural symbols taken out of context. Yet the emotional reactions of the people who owned them, fear, anxiety, or confusion, were enough to reinforce the belief that some objects were inherently dangerous. Over time, these items became part of the growing catalog of objects thought to contain dark energy, despite having no intentionally harmful origins. Across all these examples, one theme connects every type of cursed object. Human beings have always sensed that emotion leaves a mark on the world. Objects present during powerful moments, whether of grief, anger, betrayal, fear, or confusion, absorb the atmosphere around them. Once the moment passes, the object remains, carrying the invisible weight of what happened. This belief reveals something profound about ancient people and modern people alike. We understand instinctively that emotional energy is not easily erased. It settles into memories, into places, and sometimes into the objects that witness our darkest experiences. These cursed objects endure not simply because of superstition, but because they reflect the lingering imprint of human emotion, preserved across time in forms we can hold but will never fully understand. As the ancient world continued to evolve, the fears surrounding cursed objects became intertwined with a deeper understanding of human psychology. Civilizations began to realize that the true danger of these objects was not in their physical form but in the emotional memory they carried. People recognized that human beings imprint their strongest experiences onto the environment around them, and objects present during moments of extreme intensity naturally became repositories of those emotions. This understanding led ancient priests, healers, and scholars to develop methods to identify, neutralize, or isolate objects believed to contain dark energy. Their work was not driven by superstition but by observation. They saw how certain items consistently caused conflict within families, how others brought restlessness or despair to anyone who touched them, and how some objects created a sense of unease even when no one knew their history. These patterns were too consistent to ignore. One of the most important practices developed during this period was the ritual of isolation. When an object was suspected of carrying dark energy, it was placed inside a sealed chamber made of stone or clay, far from places of daily life. The goal was not to destroy the object, but to give the energy it contained a place where it could no longer influence the living. Priests believed that silence and stillness gradually weakened the emotional imprint held within the object. Some chambers were left sealed for generations, marked only by small carvings that indicated the nature of what was hidden inside. These markings served as warnings for future generations, reminders that some objects should remain untouched because the stories behind them were too heavy to disturb. Another important practice was the ritual of emotional release. In this ritual, a priest or healer would guide an individual through a process of recounting the object's known history, acknowledging the pain or conflict associated with it. The belief was that speaking the truth aloud allowed the emotional imprint to loosen its hold. After the story was told, the object was placed in running water, buried in sacred ground, or left beneath the open sky overnight. These natural elements were seen as powerful forces that could absorb and neutralize emotional residue. Although modern people may view these rituals symbolically rather than literally, they highlight a universal truth. Human beings heal when they confront the past, and they find freedom when they release what no longer belongs to them. Some cursed objects were too dangerous or too deeply charged to undergo release rituals. In these cases, ancient cultures relied on what became known as the binding method. The object was wrapped in layers of cloth, herbs, or resin to restrict the flow of energy around it. The binding symbolized the containment of unresolved emotions, ensuring that the object remained powerless. These bound objects were often placed in remote areas such as deserts, mountains, or deep forests, locations believed to have strong natural balance capable of neutralizing even the heaviest emotional imprint. Legends tell of travelers who stumbled upon these wrapped bundles and felt compelled to leave them undisturbed, sensing instinctively that they were not meant to be opened. As time passed, these rituals and practices became part of the cultural memory of entire civilizations. People understood that objects could shape emotions just as emotions could shape objects. This understanding created a collective awareness that some things must be handled with respect, caution, and sometimes distance. The stories of cursed objects served as warnings about the consequences of unresolved human experiences and as reminders of the emotional responsibility carried by every generation. They taught that darkness does not vanish simply because time moves forward. It must be acknowledged, contained, or transformed. Even today, museums, archaeologists, and collectors encounter artifacts that evoke strange sensations or unexplained discomfort. These reactions echo the ancient understanding that objects exposed to intense human experiences may carry a subtle emotional weight. Whether viewed through a historical, psychological, or symbolic lens, cursed objects continue to evoke a mix of fascination and caution. They stand as physical reminders of human stories so strong that they refuse to fade, choosing instead to cling to the material world. To everyone who follows this channel and brings life to these stories through your presence and support, thank you. Your curiosity allows us to explore the mysteries of the past with respect and understanding. May you carry forward the wisdom hidden in these ancient tales, remembering that the world around us is shaped not only by what we build, but by the emotions we leave behind.